everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I want to talk about something that has affected most of us who have ever sat in the big chair as storytellers, and something that a lot of us as players don't really think too deeply about. Because we're all familiar with Rule Zero, which is usually that the storyteller has the ability to alter, interpret, or flat out change rules at their table. And as long as everyone at the table agrees that this is the way we're going to do it, that should be fine. However, most of us who run games are not professional TTRPG creators. We are not people who make rules for a living. And even those of us who do make rules for a living can sometimes forget that there can be unintended consequences for what was probably a very well-meaning decision in the first place. And this is not news to most people. I think most of us out there have made a house rule and thought to ourselves, there's no way this could go wrong, and then 6 sessions later realize there was an important aspect of the game that we did not take into consideration when we made this ruling. And when that happens, you usually have to either write an entire rulebook of additional changes to make sure that your first change doesn't knock the entire structure down, or you have to backtrack and realize that the creators of the game decided to do things that way for a reason, and it was probably to prevent the very outcome you just ran into. But the important aspect of this, because we all know changing rules can have consequences, that's nothing new, you didn't need to come to YouTube to learn that today. However, rules incentivize certain styles of play, and they incentivize and reward players when they take certain actions. And when you change those rules, you might alter the reward or the incentive for playing a certain way, taking certain actions, and doing certain things. And that is often one of the biggest unintended consequences we have when we decide to change the rules. And I thought this week I would tell a couple of stories about times I have run into this and the well-intentioned changes that led to some pretty big shifts overall, some of which were very obvious and they should have seen coming, and others of which, well, no one really thought about until they handed it to players who would crunch through all of the options and come up with something that those who made the change never even considered. Now, for context, some of these are going to reach back to when I was a LARPer and I was playing an organized play, and it was very common for the society that I played with to have their own rulebook, because there are certain rules that work perfectly fine on the tabletop that just do not work when you're in a venue of 20 people or when you're in a worldwide game of thousands of different players who are all trying to make the rules work in their favor. So sometimes changes were perfectly fine and perfectly necessary. Other times, the best of intentions led to serious issues. As an example, when I was still playing Changeling, for those who have not played the LARP version of the New World or Chronicles of Darkness, depending on which version you're playing, your sheet is exactly the same as your sheet on the tabletop. The way the mechanics works is, instead of rolling dice, you take the number of dots that you have in whatever your dice pool would have been, and you add all those up. You will then blind pull a card from either an ace, which is a 1 and a failure, to a 10, which is an explosion, and you pull again. And then you add up all the numbers. 8 is considered one success, and every 3 after 8 is an additional success. I've just explained to you everything you need to know to play a LARP. So lots of the basic structure of the game was exactly the same as you would find on the tabletop. This includes your hitboxes. So an average number of hitboxes you would have for a character is your size, which is average of 5, plus your stamina dots, which is usually 2. 2 is the absolute average. It can go up to 5. So 7 is the average number of hits you can take before bad things start happening to you, as in you pass out. If it's lethal damage, you end up dying. If it's aggravated damage, you're just dead. And because of this, some players would have to take bigger risks than others. If you know your character is frail, you probably stay out of physical confrontations, or you stay at a large distance and you use powers and weapons that are safer for you to interact because your enemies can't reach you. On the other hand, if you are physically robust, if you have built your character to be enduring, maybe you wade right in and start swinging. However, the organization, with I am certain the best of intentions, made a rule that capped damage at a total of 5. No one, regardless of who they were, regardless of how powerful they were, how unique they were, or even how strong they were, could deal more than 5 levels of damage in a single hit. This meant that even the most frail of characters basically had a get-out-of-jail-free card of they could take one hit, no matter how hard that hit was, live to see another day, and try to escape. And this sounds, on the surface, like a change that some people could get behind. Obviously, you have a lot of players, you have a lot of situations, you have a lot of very dangerous things that could get out of storyteller control very quickly, so they wanted to make sure that no one got their character one-shotted. No one just walked in, immediately took a blow to the face, and fell over dead. Too bad, so sad, make up a new character. However, this altered the way players approached things, because when they knew with certainty they could survive at least one hit, no matter how hard it was, a lot of folks started taking really silly risks that previously they never would have considered, because they had that meta-knowledge, and it just infected their brains. They could not know that. And on the other hand, you had players who were very frustrated because they had built physical powerhouses, or they had built snipers, they had built fencers, they had built combat characters that they wanted to be very impressive, characters who, due to their supernatural nature, should have been a much bigger threat than they were. And they had been until this rule took away a lot of their power, because they could still deal max damage every time they hit. But that max damage was no longer as impressive as it had been, and even if they did something like throw a person out of a plane or run someone over with a semi-truck, that rule was still in place. You could not one-shot kill them, no matter who they were. So this led to shifts in style of play from those players, because it was no one character can deal more than 5 levels of damage in a single strike. However, this is the world of darkness. You could, if you wanted to, recruit NPCs to act as your personal bodyguards and enforcers. Because this was Changeling, you could take merits to get powerful fey creatures who listened to you and did your bidding, many of which could fly and breathe fire. So what you saw a lot of after this rule change went into effect, and you had players who still liked the idea of being able to cause mayhem, but being frustrated that they could no longer personally do it, a lot of them started recruiting armies. Because when you yourself can only deal 5, and anyone under your command can only deal 5, but if you've got 5, 6, 10 NPCs under your control, you can just point the firing squad at whatever the problem is, and they will make that problem go away. But you might notice that it is a significantly bigger pain and can lead to in-game and meta concerns that are much bigger than one person going on a rampage when you have someone leading an entire gang of enforcers. This rule change ended up becoming a not-so-great idea because it incentivized players to ignore one style of play that had been deemed less effective in favor of something that had been deemed more effective. So while the intentions might have been good, the consequences are that you now had a lot of players who were bringing a lot of additional NPCs into things. They were escalating problems far beyond what they normally would have been. What could have been just a 1v1 fight or a duel between two people, or even just letting one player have their Hulk moment and go on a small rampage so they could feel very powerful and have some fun story. Because that was taken away, it ended up just making things so much worse. And that is the sort of thing you need to think about when you're a storyteller. Because sometimes, if you go through all of the issues that a particular change might have, it's not going to cause that much of a problem. If you just want to, say, alter the way this merit works and you only get a +3 instead of a +4, that probably isn't going to escalate things too much. If you want to add an additional qualifier or qualification saying it takes an additional amount of time if you're going to craft an item, it takes an additional amount of this or that in order for you to create resources or to start rumors or to recruit people to your cause. In isolation, these might be good ideas. They might be well-intentioned thoughts. But the bigger the change and the more impact that change is going to have on your players, your Chronicle, how everyone chooses to do things, it's worth stopping and asking yourself, what would the person with the worst intentions do with this change? Because at the end of the day, that is what really trips up so many of us, is we think that the spirit in which we intend a rules change is the spirit in which that rules change is going to be received. But it is important to remember that the rules of a game are much like the rule of law. Just because you think it was intentioned to be written to allow X, someone might read it and realize that it doesn't stop them from doing Y and Z. And while that might not have been your intention, that will be the way it is read. So it's worth it to go over it with a fine-tooth comb a bit, to write it down, look at it, and maybe run it past a couple of players, particularly if you know players who are good at twisting rules until they scream. Make sure that what you think is an obvious or well-intentioned change cannot come around to bite you, because so often we don't think about what comes after that initial impact. We don't think about what happens when the change starts flowing downhill and it actually gets into the hands of players and the changes we made start making them change their behavior. Because sometimes that's really what trips us up. It's not the rule itself. It is all of the alterations that come with it. If we have changed the flow of a river, does that river now go and flood a town? Or does it just shift a couple inches to the left and now we have a slightly different area that it goes through? It's impossible to say, but it is worth thinking about, particularly since the new year is coming, and I know that's when a lot of people decide it's time to finally start that new Chronicle I've been talking about. And sometimes when we do that, we remind ourselves that, well, I really didn't like this rule. I want to run that differently. But we don't workshop it. And we don't check with our players, we don't check with other storytellers who might have tried this change before, who could put a hand on our shoulder and say, your heart is in the right place, but please trust me, do not change that. That is a load-bearing frustration, and if you move that, your players will eat you alive for it, whether they want to or not. But that is all I have for this week. If folks enjoyed this topic, then let me know. I will be happy to talk about other ST foibles and mistakes, but I have a couple of other ideas, particularly for those who are looking for inspiration for a new Chronicle, and if that's something you'd like to see, I would recommend checking out my Faces of Death idea that came out around Halloween, as that one was a little under most people's radars, but I think it was a fun idea that I really wish more people would try, particularly more storytellers who are looking for a unique way to keep games going beyond when a player character meets their untimely end. But that's all I have for this week, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Escalation Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.